Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, July 30th, 2025, and our friend Alastair Crooke is back with us. Welcome back, Alastair.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be with you, Nima.
My pleasure. Alastair, I want to start with what has happened with the Trump administration. He said that he's not interested in having a meeting with Vladimir Putin. And we know that they want to put tariffs on and secondary tariffs on Russia. They're talking about China and India. On the other hand, there was in New York Times that there was an article in New York Times. Donald Trump is said that he doubts that these tariffs would work against Russia. But when it comes to these sort of changes that are happening in the behavior of Donald Trump, what's your take on the current situation, the current policy of the Trump administration toward Russia and Vladimir Putin?
Um, well, I would say, first of all, that while he was in Scotland, Trump said again, I'm very disappointed in Russia. I'm disappointed in Putin, Russian president. I'm reducing the 50 days ultimatum I gave him to 10 or 12 days from today. That was when he was in Scotland. Now, obviously, something is pushing him towards doing this, pushing him towards some form of wanting to put pressure on Russia. Now, you mentioned tariffs, but I don't want to spend too much time on tariffs because these secondary tariffs, just simply the secondary tariffs are not going to happen. China's made this explicit, very explicit. There was a very strong statements out of China, and their position is clear. We will talk to the United States about tariffs and about trade with China and the United States only, but not going to talk about trade with any other state, with Russia, Iran, not going to talk about that. So it's clear that they don't intend. And now India has said so too. So let's leave that aside because these secondary sanctions, I mean, they may be a noise that is being promoted at the moment, but this is not a serious proposition. China has said it very clearly. We're just not going to do it. And India has said the same. So it's not going to work. So what are the alternatives and what's driving it? Well, I think one of the things that is driving it is the Epstein scandal. It's become something very powerful in the United States, and it's something that I don't think is going to go away very easily. And it is becoming quite important in terms of his MAGA base. The MAGA base have always been suspicious about who is it who really controls America? Who is it who's really in charge of America? There seems always to be, yes, this Congress and the parties and the leadership, but that somehow there is another layer to this that they have always felt that is above it and superior and actually sort of directing policies about war and policies about economics and other things such as that. So very much the question is, well, who's running America? And I think when Trump at that cabinet meeting said, "Oh, nothing to see here, nothing, forget it." I mean, you're not still talking about Epstein. He's dead. He's gone. No, there's nothing here. Let's move on. And this was not good enough for the MAGA, because first of all, he promised something quite different. And so there is a deep questioning going on. And there are two parts to that, really, two reasons behind that. One is because Trump was a very close friend of Epstein for 15 years, well, 10 anyway, 10 more years. They lived about 2 kilometers apart. in Palm Beach. I mean, they were could walk to each other's house. They attended each other's parties. They swam in the same pool of, political leadership, oligarchs, big money, big, if you like, international personalities, and big intelligence services, all mixed up in this pool. It's a pool that Trump also swam in. I can't say that he did anything that was improper in that part, but nonetheless, the magazine, he was part of it, and it's tainted him. And he knows he's tainted, and he knows also now, I think, that it's not going to be deflected and sort of put aside by some other new diversion that is found. So it's not going to go away. And so he is facing the sense, not yet, but it's increasingly coming, it seems, that he's becoming a lame duck president. Second-term presidents at some point become lame ducks, as a matter of general events. And he's, I think, very fearful of becoming a lame duck. It's not in his makeup. It's not part of his character. He wants to dominate the headlines day after day after day with one headline or another headline. He wants to be the action person, not having people wonder who's going to inherit. Who's going to inherit the MAGA? Who's going to inherit the Republicans when he's gone? I don't think he will tolerate that. He will be able to. And so he needs diversion. He needs something big, a big headline. Well, he just had one in Scotland when he steamrolled von der Leyen. Okay, I mean, big headlines, they crushed the Europeans. The Europeans have no one to blame but themselves for having been crushed in that way, in my view. And of course, they made themselves even more dependent on the United States. For the elites, this is perfect. They love being dependent in Washington, being part of the Washington crowd. But for most Europeans, they've actually, and particularly in places like France and others, there's been a sense that they need to reduce dependence on the United States. If Europe is to become sovereign again, it has to ease itself away, or wean, as they like to call it themselves, of dependency on NATO. I mean, you go to Brussels, what's the other side from the Commission? Of course, NATO. NATO determines European policy. So he's had that success, so it might have emboldened him. So maybe that's why he shortened the timeline on the ultimatum to Russia. But in that also, he faces a huge problem if he wants, as I'm sure Kellogg and others will probably be urging them, put more pressure on Putin. That's the only way we'll get a deal. To get a ceasefire, we've got to have Putin under pressure. So let's escalate. If tariffs are not going to be very effective, let's escalate. But the locker is bare. There's no arms inventory. There's no inventory of weapons, of missiles. I mean, apart from a few paltry Patriot missiles, 7 or 8, the Europeans don't have any. America is largely out of that sort of missiles. So what to do? Well, what has been floated off is to really escalate more seriously and move to firing Tomahawk missiles into Moscow or at St. Petersburg. David Ignatius in the Washington Post said this has been discussed in the White House really until quite recently. Well, this is going to big war if you do that. And incidentally, it's no surprise when I talk about big war that earlier this month, the United States quietly deployed tactical nuclear weapons to the United Kingdom for the first time since the end of the Cold War. The US sent the new B-61 nuclear bombs to its base in RAF Lakenheath in England. What does that mean? We don't know, but it's quite striking that for the first time, tactical nuclear weapons. What does it mean? Maybe it means that they're not confident that the Tomahawks will be successful. Maybe Russia will just shoot them down. They haven't had a very great performance, American missiles, in Iran. So what's the alternative? What can he do? If Russia is just too difficult and too complex, well, of course, it's Iran. Iran there. And what did he say? He said also in Scotland, apart from, if you like, dissing President Putin, he said, Iran is so nasty. They're so nasty in their statements. They got hit. We cannot allow them to have nuclear weapons. They are still talking about uranium enrichment. Who talks like that? It's so stupid. We will not allow it. Well, there we are. And then he said in Scotland, yeah, I'm thinking of another hit on their nuclear program. So I think that Iran understands these dynamics perfectly well. They understand and think that there is a possibility, a quite a probability perhaps, of escalation against Russia. Not in 50 days, but possibly quite soon. But they also follow that logic that if Russia, if it's going to move to, because as I say, there is this big void between a few token weapons, a few handfuls of Patriot missiles, and going up to Tomahawks or going beyond Tomahawks, maybe that isn't what Trump wants. And so to show, to divert from the present crisis in Washington, the Epstein crisis, and to show that he's back in charge and pulling it all back, well, there is the possibility of an attack on Iran. But I'd like to just say, because what we see in this process is there are many shibboleths about Iran and what happened in the attack on Iran. And I just want to say something, if you're content, about what I see as this handful of shibboleths that need really to be collapsed. The first shibboleth was that Iran proved absolutely clearly, that it is not a house of cards. You recall the attack on the 12th of June, on Friday, the 13th, of June, was intended to, if you like, implode this house of cards. That's what Trump thought was coming. He made that very plain in some of the statements he was making, some of the comments, which were recorded by Wolf, who, not directly from Trump, but he was talking to people whom Trump had spoken to. And Trump was saying, is it going to work? Is it going to happen? Is this going to be a great success, a stunning success? Is this going to be a showstopper? The Israelis are so good, so good. And obviously, he had accepted the narrative that Iran was just, one small shove. In Iran, the leadership would collapse, particularly after the decapitation of the military and some of the scientific elite. It would collapse and it would be like Syria. Anyone could just walk in. Israel would be able to walk in, if you like, to what was remained as it was left immobilized and impotent and unable to respond with no leadership. And this was the model that they're all so obsessed with in Washington, which is the model of Hezbollah, where they feel that, this proved the value of decapitation. They proposed decapitation also for the Houthis. Hegseth suggested that they wanted to annihilate the leadership of the Houthis. But the one thing was obvious, if that was the intent, the opposite occurred. Iran emerged more unified, more collective, more purposeful. I think that was one of the sort of shibboleths that was demolished. The second shibboleth was really the game changer in this period, in this era, that Iran demonstrated a change in the entire paradigm of warfare. Because what changed wasn't just that they have fast missiles and hypersonics. What changed was the accuracy of these missiles. The accuracy of these missiles was quite unexpected, but not all of them, because during that period of the conflict, Iran was also firing old missiles and less accurate missiles too. But when it comes to the sophisticated and the hypersonic missiles, they were accurate to almost within a meter. So they could take out. What accurate warheads means is that the Mossad HQ, MI6 headquarters, or the German military headquarters, or a German missile factory in Germany can be struck accurately without collateral damage. I mean, this changes the whole calculus, that this type of accuracy with missiles is very different, because the previous view was that if you wanted to attack a city, whether it's Tel Aviv or whether it is another city, of course, here we're talking about Israel and Tel Aviv and the Iranian response. If you wanted to take a city, it would really require a nuclear bomb to attack a city because of its, if you like, its breadth of its damage. Or you could use less accurate missiles. This is what's happening in Russia at the moment. Use less accurate conventional or missiles against apartment blocks and against civilian architecture. But this is really considered to be a form of terrorism rather than conventional, if you like, warfare. The next shibboleth that was destroyed, the first one being, the change from the accuracy which makes all of the old missile systems really redundant, accuracy that was demonstrated too in the attack on Qatar, on the Udeid base in Qatar, when Iran took out precisely the new radar and international communication center of the Americans there. There was one of these huge bubbles of radar and communications. It's gone. It's completely gone. And the Qataris were not able to do anything to stop this happening at all. They were impotent. And that's the next shibboleth, is, the defense system, the Western defense system basically failed. The US THAAD system, the high altitude defense system, accounted for almost half of all the interceptions against Iranian missiles, perhaps because Israel did have not sufficient arrow interceptor capacity. They were very short. It was said, the Israeli press said, if the conflict had gone on another couple of days, Israel would have run out of arrow missiles. And as a result, the United States used up to about 14% of all its THAAD interceptors. Its full 14% for its whole inventory, which normally would take 3 to 8 years to replenish on current production. I mean, simply put, the math does not work for this type of defense any longer. The quality of intercepts that the West has are not sufficient either for the Russian Orenchik missile or indeed for the Iranian fast missiles, the hypersonic missiles. It just doesn't make much sense. Then the next, if you like, the next shibboleth, as I would call it, that has changed from this war is the idea that Iran now has to, after the American attack on the four nuclear sites, Natanz and Isfahan, etc., that Iran has to rebuild the previous nuclear program. It's got to build it again, and that will take years, and that they believe that that has set back the program for a time. That is simply wrong. We believe, and this I'm talking about we, I'm actually meaning the United States and Israel, with good reason, believe that most of the Iranian stockpile of highly enriched uranium survived the attack and is accessible. And then we have, I think the most important thing is that Ted Postel, whom I'm sure you heard of and your audience will know, is considered to be, in sort of technical terms, the most important person, expert with knowledge of nuclear missile capabilities and the nuclear process as a whole. And he has been saying recently that Iran must be viewed now as an undeclared nuclear weapon state now. And why does he say that? He says that because it's highly likely in his view. First of all, it's highly likely that in his view that Fordo was not the centrifuge chamber was not hit by the Americans, and it's highly likely that most of Iran's highly enriched uranium survived these strikes. As a result, Iran could make do with a centrifuge facility much smaller than the existing plants at Fordo or Natanz, which were designed to accommodate thousands and even tens of thousands of centrifuges, respectively. What he's talking about is something quite different. And this is the foremost technical expert acknowledged by the United States as being the one person that understands these things very well. He's saying with the 408 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which is what the IEA say Iran had at the time of the attack. If this was converted to hexafluoride gas for uranium-235, it takes almost no enrichment to go to 83.7% enrichment. In 2023, the IEA found highly enriched uranium at 83.7%. That's as near as you can get. I mean, that's 90%, basically. That's weapons grade enrichment. Enough, Postel says, for 10 atomic bombs. He suggests this wasn't intended as a bomb. It was intended just for Iran to make the experiment that they could go to 90% without great difficulty. But then what he says is really significant, very important. He says at this level of 60%, it would require only 60 square meters of space that would be sufficient to move to weapons in highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. 60 square meters is the size of a small apartment. I mean, it's nothing. It's, quite a tiny apartment. And this would be possible, and it would require little power input to do that. Some tens of kilowatts of power, nothing major, nothing out of the ordinary. And he said all that it would require with the 60% would be a cascade of 174 centrifuges. And in 4 to 5 weeks, they would have enough enriched to 83.7. 83.7 is the figure the IEA gave for what they found in 23 for one bomb, 4 to 5 weeks to get to an atomic bomb. They could take the enriched hexafluoride and convert it to uranium metal. He says, it's not difficult. It's quite easy. It's not a great technical feat. A small operation, a facility of 120 square feet is sufficient. And then he goes on, and this I think is really so important. He says that building a spherical atomic bomb would require about 14 kilograms of highly enriched uranium metal 235 surrounded by a reflector. This is not high tech, he says. This is easy stuff. Just assemble the pieces. No test is needed. He says, I notice he used the word we, when we dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, there was no testing. We didn't test it. We knew it would work. It was so simple, we knew it would work. So it's wrong to think, this is the shibboleth that I'm really getting to. It's wrong to think that, the testing would be the litmus test, would be the giveaway as to whether Iran had moved to a weapon or not. It wouldn't. It is really unknowable whether it has done this or it hasn't done this. But building this bomb would be very easy. Wrong to think also that they don't have delivery capacity. A bomb of that sort would be 150 kilograms, whereas most Iranian missiles that were fired at Israel at the time had a warhead of about 460 to 500 kilograms. So what he is suggesting is the status of Iran is already obscure, is already deliberately kept, if you like, obscured from the rest of the world. As a policy, Iran is going to leave us in doubt as to whether there is or isn't such a bomb, same as Israel practices the same process. So all of this about an attack, what I'm saying, just to be very plain, what I'm saying is all of this talk that Trump is making about an attack and we need to finish the job is kabuki theater. Iran produced, since they stopped monitoring it, 13,000 centrifuges. And, Postel, who has done it and shows it and presents it, the whole cascade, he is talking of only 174 centrifuges. Quite clearly, that's not difficult. It's there. They would have it. And he explains in a very clear way that, actually building a small atomic bomb is no great technical feat. Okay, they've killed 12 senior scientists. It's show. It's not serious because, Postal laughs. You could put this together in your garage if you really want to. It's not that complicated. You just have to assemble the parts and presto, you don't have to test it or anything like this. So all of this is kabuki theory. It is not really, it's a Potemkin village, a facade that has been erected, because it's not about that. Because, if it only takes one small apartment and you could enrich to weapons grade, and that would not take all of your 408 kilograms of enriched material. I mean, bombing Fordo again, bombing Natanz again, bombing Isfahan again. What's the point? They're past that. They're at the stage of uranium enrichment when they can go to weapons grade enrichment, whoosh, like that, 4 weeks at the most. And then it's the question of getting the right type and turning it into uranium metal, and you have the components ready for a weapon. I'm not saying it to suggest that therefore Iran will do that or has done it or is going to do this. I'm just saying bombing Natanz again, bombing Fordo, which had the old big industrial tens of thousands of centrifuges. I mean, it just is an irrelevancy. And I suspect that, if Postel knows this, so does Gabbard, Tulsi Gabbard. He briefs her and tells her these things. And I'm sure she told Trump, what you're doing isn't going to, postpone the nuclear development of Iran for years, set it back 10 years, because they've got enough. They've undoubtedly got it. And if they haven't, okay, they actually didn't even bother to use the bunker buster bombs in Isfahan, because the tunnels there are so deep that they just use conventional weapons to block the exits. And they said that will set the program back by years. Come on, this is nonsense. It takes an excavation. It took actually, I think it's already been observed that at Isfahan, they had one tunnel open within a week. Iran has bulldozers. It has excavators. There's just a blockage at the tunnel. You can clear it, Tens of years? No, I would think 10 days would probably be sufficient. So what does all this mean? What is it saying? What is it saying to us? I think ultimately is that it's not about the nuclear program. If there's another attack on Iran, it's not about the nuclear program. It's really the one thing that Israel ultimately wants and has said. The only way to make sure Iran doesn't have a bomb is to implode the state, to have regime change. And regime change is very important to America in Iran, because a regime change could open the whole way for a greater Israel to emerge across the landscape. And also because it would affect Russia. The whole of this goes back to that RAND document, which is, the policy must be to put as much pressure on Russia and Iran to make the states implode and to become like Syria is today, a barren landscape of balkanization with people set against each other, killing each other, with sectarian violence taking place, and ISIS now installed across parts of the region to render it sufficiently chaotic, which has always been the Israeli ultimate battle plan for, going back to Ben Gurion, for the region, is that they want it divided, fragmented, balkanized, weak, unable, if you like, to challenge Israel in any way. So I think, all of these things are really just, these are what I call the main shibboleths, and they should be, knocked over, because, Postel, who is unchallenged as the technical authority in these matters in the United States and Israel too, And he said, he finished off, I think, when he was commenting, and he said, well, the only thing one has to say, and, one of the Israeli colonels said it to Netanyahu, the only thing you're going to get from attacking Iran in this way is a nuclear weapon state. That's what you're going to get, nothing else. Is that what you want? Is that in your interest to do it like that? What interest is this? And I would say the same. But I finish by just saying, unfortunately, that does not mean that there will not be an attack on Iran. I do think that given the political circumstances in Washington at this time, given the sort of hype there is and the need to have good headlines, positive headlines coming out, Europe was an easy one. They've got an easy one. But now it's not working well for Russia. It's not working with China. It's not working. The whole tariffs process is not working that well. He wants another success. Now, it won't be a success, but maybe it can be presented in this world of perception reality, making perception reality. There can be another attack on Iran, and people say, therefore, we've obliterated it even further. If we did one obliteration, now we have two obliteration, and it will be 2 decades before anything can come. It's just narrative, it's theater, it's presentational reality. Nima, that's really what I wanted to say.
You've mentioned the way that Donald Trump was talking about the Iranian, I would assume, Iranian president or Iranian foreign minister, and the way that they want to enrich uranium. After all, the policy, the official policy in Iran is to enrich uranium in Iran. But it doesn't seem that, I don't know, how did you find the latest interviews that the president of Iran had with Tucker Carlson, and later on we had the foreign minister of Iran giving an interview on Fox News. They were criticized in Iran about the way that they somehow tried to communicate with the American people, with the American politicians. And yesterday, in response to what you read from Donald Trump and his statement about the Iranian enrichment, the foreign minister of Iran, Araghchi, said that we know what has happened during the 12 days of war between Iran and between Iran and Israel. You know, where we hit the targets in Israel, with the case of Qatar, with the case of the American base. And next time would be impossible to cover up if they attack us again. What's going on when it comes to the Iranian officials, when it comes to the Iranian policy toward the United States? What's going on in their mind? How they can manage some sort of communication with the Trump administration? It's impossible when you think that Donald Trump is seeking a new opportunity, as you mentioned, about the fragility, or somehow his position is not that good in the United States. They need something big to change the atmosphere. How is that going to play out in the mind of Iranians, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, as you know, I can't see into the minds of the Iranian leadership at all. I don't have, or the Russian leadership, but one can make some more or less, I think, general observations about it. And that is, there is a very close coordination between Iran, Russia, and China. Very close, and it has got closer as a result of what happened in the conflict, in the American attack on Iran. Got much closer about that. And I think that there are two things that I think that what I said about the likelihood of escalation against Russia is an assessment that is widely held in Russia. that something is coming, and something is coming probably in the not too distant future. What type? Whether it will be sanctions, but sanctions are not something that Russia is frightened of. I mean, they're sanctioned anyway. So, or is it going to be some sort of military exercise? We can see already the European and American deep state is trying to encircle Russia, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, also Kazakhstan, trying to put pressure, extending Russia, as they call it, extending Russia by having pressure points across, and then firing all these drones, these Ukrainian drones, into Russia, not with a great effect, but it's intended as a sort of psychological implement. So they think they expect something is coming because they see the pressures growing. I mean, and the pressures, not only when I say Trump is sort of weak vis-a-vis MAGA and the base, but he is also seen to be weakened vis-a-vis the hawks in America and the Israeli firsters, who are pushing hard. And so we can see that. And Russia sees that too. This, Lindsey Graham is the most obvious, but there are many others who are pushing hard for more pressure on Russia. Putin cannot be allowed to win. I mean, this is becoming really existential for these people, not for the MAGA base, but for that segment of Trump's support, which comes from Israeli firsters and from the old sort of war hawks of the neocons. And they are pushing, they say that pressure must be increased. So Russia has, I think, that assessment. And as a consequence, Iran is fully informed of that view. I'm quite sure that Iran knows and understands the Russian assessment and shares it. So if they share it, they have also the sense of a high probability that there's going to be another attack on Iran. And I agree. I think it is a high probably higher probability than an attack on Russia that goes all the way to big war. I don't know that Trump will want to do that. But I think there's a probability of attack, quite high probability of attack on Iran. And so Iran is, I think, working flat out to prepare for that. And preparing in coordination with its allies, preparing for this attack. And, again, I didn't mention because there are other shibboleths that need to be knocked down, but one of them is that all of Iranian air defense systems was knocked out on the 12th of June, 13th of June, by the Israelis. That wasn't so. There was some damage done, but mostly they were done from, in fact, the Israelis didn't enter Iranian airspace during that time. They did part of the damage to the air defenses came from insurgents inserted from Kurdistan. And then the others were from aircraft that flew right up in the north and circled around into Azerbaijani airspace. And then the Israelis fired the bigger weapons from circling down to the Caspian Sea and then firing directly to Tehran from there, attempting to damage more the air defenses. But it wasn't as described. Oh, well, we could fly, it was open airspace. It wasn't. And even for the Americans, when they bombed Fordo and others. Now, I don't know what happened, but what I believe and been suggested to me was that was agreed. And I suspect that the Russians spoke to the Iranians and said, look, it's going to be a once and done. Trump said, we're just going to do it once and it's done, okay? So then we'll have ceasefire, sort of that type of discussion, which we've seen before in the region, of a carefully coordinated and choreographed exchange of attacks, if you like, deliberately sort of conceived so it comes to an end. So I suspect that, Iran took the decision, and the Russians were in accordance with it, that let them come and bomb Fordo. I mean, as I've tried to show with what Postel said, it doesn't really matter anyway. In the bigger, of course, I don't think they probably hit it for various reasons we can explore. I don't think they actually damaged the centrifuge hall in Fordo. We don't know, because until those entrances, I think there are 5 into Fordo, until the excavators have been and unearthed them and people have gone in to check. But I don't think we'll be told the truth. I think it's in interest to have for Iran to maintain a certain degree of uncertainty and a certain obscurity about what is their program. In fact, I think it suits them quite well to say, well, okay, so you've obliterated our nuclear program. So why is all this fuss about getting the IEA back in again? To inspect what? You said you finished the program. So it's quite useful, this narrative. And so I don't think we'll know exactly what it is in Fordo or Isfahan. But, both the Americans and the Israelis both agree that the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium was removed before the attacks happened. So I think they are thinking. So when you ask me, about the if you like, the interviews with Tucker Carlson and also in the Financial Times and others, and I know they were not well received by sections of Iranian political polity. I think that what the aim was like Putin does, really, is to keep channels to the Americans open, to keep some sort of process, political process going, even if no one has any expectations. And I'm sure Putin has no expectations of it achieving anything at this stage. The last Istanbul talks were a very clear example of that. I don't think there's any, and of course, Trump's position, I read it out at the beginning, was, how dare they talk about, enrichment? No one speaks like that. They must be brought down to earth. Well, so what's the point of the talks? It's about sort of the wider politics. It's about the BRICS and the idea of the BRICS of instituting the set of everyone who signed the NPT has a right to enrich uranium and has a right to peaceful use of nuclear power. It's about, if you like, keeping a constituency. Both Russia with Ukraine needs to keep a constituency in places like where you are, the global south, to give a sort of sense that, Iran isn't just being an aggressor, it's ready to talk. I think the hardest part, and I'm not sure whether those talks achieve this, I remember the previous foreign minister of Iran, Abdullahian, who was killed in that helicopter incident along with the president some little time ago. And I remember him speaking, and he was really a formidable character. And he spoke very well, and he said what, Iran's policy must be diplomacy, yes, but deterrence has to balance it. There's got to be the right balance so that diplomacy doesn't spell weakness. And that there is behind that, the diplomacy, a clear sense of strength that sits behind it and of meaningful deterrence, i.e. that when Iran says something, it means it and is capable of doing it and probably will do it. Unless you have that balance, and I remember him giving a talk saying, it's difficult. But that's what needs to be done. There has to be a process of bringing on people who, can be brought into the Iranian camp, if you like, on its side, but not at the price of appearing weak, not at the price of making it seem as if they're not serious in their deterrent capacity, but really are opting only that the diplomacy is taking priority over deterrence, rather than having a very clear balance of the two.
Alistair, when it comes to the region, I'm talking about Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia. We had the attack on Iran. We had these sort of conflicts between Iran and Azerbaijan, then between Azerbaijan and Russia. The case of Armenia and the way that the West was somehow capable of manipulating the situation in Armenia with the Zangezur corridor. What's going on in that region? What's going on, and how Russia and Iran, how do Russia and Iran perceive what's going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia in terms of, because when you look at the big picture of the region and what's going on in Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran in the West Asia, it's all about getting to China, but it's in the process of getting there. They're not there. And do you feel that China would perceive it as a threat, an existential threat when it comes to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and we know that Russia, the case of Russia is so important for them. But how about the West Asia? How does China perceive that?
In the same way as Russia does. They understand that these are attempts to disrupt the road and belt, the east-west, and with Azerbaijan, the north-south corridors. They understand that this is about trying to impose the economic hegemony of the United States via the Caucasus and via Central Asia. And, the Caucasus are the soft, can you call it the soft underbelly of Russia in a sense? The Chechen War was which was promoted by the West. And now what do we have in the region? We have ISIS 2.0 emerging, has come back after 10 years. I mean, I saw it from the beginning in Afghanistan when it was first. I was there when the Wahhabis arrived and ISIS emerged and destroyed all the other groups, Islamic groups. Much of Kandahar was Sufi, parts of Pakistan was Sufi. They're all now Salafist, 100% Salafist. This is what's happened with us. So this is a real effort to, first of all, encircle Iran. This was what Syria has been, 10 years to try and cut off Iran from Hezbollah and from that part of the region. It's using ISIS to, if you like, isolate the Shia, not just there, but in Iraq, in Lebanon, as well as in Syria, to try and, if you like, weaken the Shia. It's not doing it, it's actually doing the opposite. What I see is actually the Shia, of course, feel the pressure, for Iraqis to see ISIS back on the playing field is a terrible thing to behold. So I think all of this has been part of it. And I think, therefore, the corridor, the Zangezur corridor that you mentioned, through Armenia, I mean, I have seen, but I can't say that it's accurate. I have seen that this corridor, which is promoted by Turkey, and the aim is to have a Turkic sphere going right through the corridor, because Turkey follows this idea that the Turkic people extends right up into Russia, into Altai Mountains, into the Urals, and into the China, and that they all shared a common language once and a common. This has been debunked by all the experts, the DNA and all of this. It's not true, but it has political power, and they're pushing this. And of course, Turkey is part of NATO and working closely with Israel and America. And the aim, and I saw plans, but I don't know if they're accurate, that this corridor would be then leased for 99 years by Armenia and would run along the northern border of Iran, effectively, cutting Iran off from going north to Georgia and to Russia, that corridor, and that Americans would put 1,000 troops. Now, it may not be right. I'm myself rather uncertain about that. But look, if this is really what's going on, then I suspect that Iran will go to war over this. They won't accept this. And I think also Azerbaijan is under a lot of pressure too now from Russia. You probably saw a little while ago, I can't remember the date, but about a few weeks or a month ago, 2 refineries in Ukraine were struck by the Russians and were destroyed. I believe that they were personally owned by Aliyev of Azerbaijan. Then more recently, we've had the refinery in in the south of Ukraine attacked. This was a refinery belonging to Sokal, the Azerbaijani energy part. It was at Odessa. It was a part of the port at Odessa. But was it on, if you like, it was a transit route for Azeri light fuel through this Odessa port, onward transmission mainly to Israel. And that was destroyed. It had been left intact for this time because I suspect because Russia, likes to have an influence in Azerbaijan. But I think the view of Russia has changed a lot towards Azerbaijan because I think they suspect that just as Azerbaijan was providing for the insertion of, if you like, jihadists, some of them even from Turkestan, Turkmens, and others, Uzbekis, coming into Iran in order to disrupt Iran from that sector during the 13th of June. Then I believe, and I have no evidence, but I believe the Russians may suspect that Azerbaijan, some of their criminal groups that Azerbaijan had facilitated the insertion of these elements into Russia that were connected with the attacks on the strategic airfields. The standoff attacks from containers and from trucks with sliding roofs, and the drones would come out and attack Russia's strategic nuclear force. In those didn't work in 3 of the airfields, but in 2 it did. But they were pre-positioned, like weapons were pre-positioned into Iran. Weapons were pre-positioned, and perhaps, as I say, I have no evidence of this, but perhaps Azerbaijan was also involved in the pre-positioning of drones into Russia at that time. But anyway, Russia's taken quite severe action by destroying 3 of its refineries where the oil from Baku was transiting and being used, and a source of revenue, particularly to the president. So tensions are rising everywhere across the region. And of course, they're looking to Tanaf sits on a thing that no one talks about much, but is called the David Corridor, which reaches from the Golan through the Al Tanaf American base further into the Kurdish area of Syria, and then adjoins, that the geography matches up. So another possible, of course, these will be presented as sort of commerce, trade links, But also it's about putting NATO on the border of Iran and putting hostile, if you like, elements on the border of Iran. And I don't think Iran can accept that, just as Russia will not accept the Caucasus to be stirred up again. That's a different part of this war. At one level, there is the conventional war with Russia and Iran, and at another level, we have this huge attempt to sort of weaken and move closer to enveloping Iran with hostile elements. But as we saw, I mean, the Iranian people all came together in an extraordinary demonstration of unity and of support particularly for the Supreme Leader. We saw that during the funerals and afterwards when he appeared in public or appeared in those small meetings with other Iranian leaders, and everyone was so excited by his presence. And he is really sort of an icon in Iran now.
Just before wrapping up, Alastair, this session, how we know that for the case of Ukraine, Europe got somehow involved in the case in the war, and the way that right now you can say that Europe is on the front line, and the United States somehow, Donald Trump is bragging about that the Europeans gonna pay the United States gonna give them weapons to send them to Ukraine. But putting that aside, how is that gonna be? How do they feel about the case of Iran? If something big happened, let's assume they're gonna attack Iran, something big happens in the West Asia, in the Middle East. Iran has the capability of blocking the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el Mandab in the Red Sea. That would hugely influence Europe. That would be hugely consequential for Europe. We know that for Europe, and we know that they don't receive directly from Russia the Russian gas and oil. They have to receive it from somewhere. Do you think that these concerns are considered by the European leaders, mainly by the United Kingdom, Germany, and France?
I think they should be considered. I mean, what you're talking about is, if you like, if the Euro 3 initiates snapback on Iran, why shouldn't Iran snap back at Europe? Not necessarily by blocking the Hormuz, but what the Yemenis are doing in the Red Sea is that you have to get permission from Iran to pass, and that Germany, France, and Britain would probably not get permission for any vessel that was likely to aid or assist those countries to pass through the Hormuz. It's clearly a powerful tool that Iran has. Now, are the Europeans aware, and does this concern them? In one sense, it does, but I think that when we look at the leadership of Europe, it is so abysmal and so desperate because, everything, they are, if you like, they're at odds with China. The trip to China that von der Leyen just made was a disaster. It was cut short. The Chinese just sent her home. They're at odds with Trump. I mean, Trump does not like the Europeans generally, or von der Leyen. They're at odds with Iran on this promoting snapback. And they are in a deep fiscal, economic, financial crisis. At the end of the day, all of this is about money. The conflict about Trump, the tariffs, money, it's about keeping the dollar hegemony, which is so important for the United States facing this debt crisis that they have. And so you would imagine that they would take this into consideration. But look what happened at that meeting in Scotland. I mean, it was quite striking. People, saying it was a complete humiliation of Europe, which is true, which it was, but not for one portion of Europeans. For most of us, it's a disaster. There will be the standards of living of Europeans are going to suffer even more. The absolute idiocy of sort of having cut off from Russian energy, cheap Russian piped energy in exchange for liquefied natural gas, bought hundreds of billions. Von der Leyen said we will buy from America. It costs something like 7 or 8 times as much as pipeline gas from Russia. That's why, European firms are going out of business. The medium-term firms are going out of business, and the big firms are having to move to America and take their best employees with them. It's a disaster for Europe. But I think that's, for most people, they will be extremely angry about this, about the humiliation and about what the French Prime Minister, I think he called the complete submission to America that it involved. But the elites are dependent on Washington and on Wall Street, and Paris is dependent on Wall Street and on the debt markets. And so one of the things, what did it increase? It meant that Europe was still part of the financial system, is still linked into the financial system. It may be that most of the European savings will have to be sort of transferred to Europe. But for the elites, that doesn't matter. They're rich anyway, ultra rich. And for the elites, it doesn't matter so much. What they want is to be in that magic circle that we started off our discussion about, that circle of oligarchs, intelligence services, of politically connected, the elite of the elite that is based in Washington, Rome, and Paris, and London. They want to be part of that. They are dependency. They see their survival as being dependent. There's an old story. It's like once you're in that elite, it's like being on one of these super yachts. Everything is available. Literally everything is there on the yacht. The moment you say, I'd like to get off, you're pushed over the side and you drown. Rather like Maxwell, the close associate of Epstein, when he said the wrong thing and asked to get off the system. And so they understand that. And so they revel in their dependency on, the deep state, the Wall Street, the feudal tech lords. This is this is the pool in which they swim. This is the yacht on which they have boarded. They don't want to announce they're getting off it because they know you're out, you're overboard if they do.
Quite frightening. Thank you so much, Alastair, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Nima, thank you very much for inviting me on your program today.
Yeah.